Good evening, everyone. I think you can hear me okay. The topic for today is visions of international peace, and I just want to tell you a little bit how I came up with the idea of organizing this. This is actually the kick-off discussion for a workshop that's going to take place tomorrow. And I want to cordially welcome everyone who's going to be part of that workshop. It's a research network that is sponsored by the Austrian Research Association, the ÖFG, and we're going to focus on peaceful change. And there's going to be all kinds of workshops and conferences to follow, and the usual goal of such a thing is to get an edited book out of that, or a special issue in a journal. This time around, it's not like that. This time around, it's really just to think about how to approach the topic. And in order to help us, so we're actually quite selfish, we invited the 5 of you. And the purpose of that is, although the network is very, very heterogeneous, it's very pluralistic, so 17 professors from 10 different universities and institutes in Austria, there are 9 different disciplines represented, so it's really very pluralistic. Nevertheless, I think it's a very, very good start if we listen to practitioners, if we listen to young voices, and if we put in alternative visions of peace as well, and I'm thinking about the arts there in particular. Because of that, I'm very, very happy. I'm really delighted to have everyone here on the podium. I'm going to introduce everyone very, very briefly. I should do so in a much more elaborate manner, probably, but I'll do so very briefly because I want to have time for the discussion afterwards. There is, on the very left-hand side, is Michael Asiedu, who's usually in these kinds of settings sitting where you are sitting now. He is a student of ours, second-year master student, a very good one, I have to say, otherwise I wouldn't have picked him. And amongst other things, he knows a lot about traditional African or local African conceptions of peace. Then one further is Walter Kemp, and Walter has worked lots of different places. So he's now with the OSCE Secretariat. He was with the UNODC for quite a while, and he was also the director of the International Peace Institute here in Vienna, so the Vienna branch of it. And Walter, I think my very, very first conference presentation I made was with you. That was in Forlì in Italy, long time ago. To my left is Angela Kane, who is a senior fellow at the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation, and a vice director of the International Institute for Peace. And there are lots and lots of reasons why one would invite Angela for an event like this. So we'll ask all kinds of questions about peace negotiations in different parts of the world, perhaps also a little bit about nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament. Then to my right is Susanne Jalka, who is engaged in developing a psychoanalytical approach to peace. So she's really a peace researcher in the very truest sense, multidisciplinary, is teaching at the University of Applied Arts in Vienna. And then to the right is Lukas Wank. He's the co-director of Shabka. And that I may also say, so we have this think tank group, FAT, that is meeting every 2 or 3 months or so. And the Shabka people are always the youngest people, and they're probably definitely amongst the sharpest. So that's why I thought I need someone from Shabka here as well. So, so much about a very quick introduction. And I'm going to move now from more general questions to more specific questions. I'll do that for something like half an hour, depending on how I see how excited you become or how urgent questions are going to be for you. And then I'll definitely allow for a lot of input from the audience as well. And Jalka, maybe allow me to start with you, because I think you're very well equipped to deal with a very, very broad question. It's actually, what is peace?
Well, the simple answer always was that peace is when there is no war. And of course, nowadays we consider that this is far too little to say about this subject. And my personal idea about peace is if we learn to understand tensions, conflicts as something that has a promising energy in it, a promising possibility to gain understanding and knowledge and to learn to negotiate and all these possibilities that come out of conflicts, we still consider, most of us still consider conflicts as something that is a threat we try to avoid, or we develop all kinds of activities to try to go away or avoid and not realize that there is a conflict as long as possible. And I think this is exactly wrong. We have to learn that conflicts are a big resource of energy. And the old ways of dealing with conflict was always with violence. Yeah? Either with violent thoughts or words or deeds. Yeah? And the main idea now is to learn, and this has a lot to do with the development of society towards a democracy, that conflicts are a chance. And if we use conflicts, because the conflict in one person, the conflict between two people, the conflict between groups of people, and the conflict between nations, they all have a very similar escalation development. So to understand the matters of conflict, the development possibilities, the ways where you can get into it and de-escalate or transform it into another way of relation. This is how I consider we will live in peace. We can learn to be peaceful. Peace is everything else but harmony. Harmony is maybe a short time, a short minute experience, and beautiful and wonderful, but it's never a possibility to really stay. And it shouldn't be, because then we wouldn't know anything else. So to understand that dealing with tensions in a self reliable way and to use it as energy, this is, as I see it, the way towards active peace.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Michael. I wanna follow up on that because Jalka mentioned different levels, so from the local to the global, basically. And when one looks at local peace, what kind of concept of local peace do we actually have?
First of all, I want to say thank you very much, Professor Kornprobst, for this opportunity. It's an incredible honor to be here instead of there, as you pointed out in the first instance. And in the local perspective, there's several concepts of peace. First, you'd have to start with the approaches to peace, and for me, I see peace and its antithesis of conflict, and one cannot talk about peace without the other. And then if you're talking about peace, then obviously you're talking about its three-pronged approach. For instance, in health, you've got the diagnosis, you've got the prognosis, and then you've got therapy. If you bring it to the local context, you've got the diagnosis to be sort of an ill society, a society in conflict. That we know, and then you've got a prognosis. You know what caused that conflict, you know what is happening. It is the therapy, which is sort of the prescription to the conflict. which is about mediation, which is about conflict resolution, that we tend to get wrong. And in the local parlance, when people talk about peace, they are talking about freedom, they are talking about liberation, they are talking about development, they are talking about the ability to put food on the table for their family. It's not some macroeconomic index or some international setting somewhere. They're talking about very, very basic things that mean so much to them rather than this holistic notion of some peace happening somewhere. So that draws into the sphere of really practical and local traditional understandings of peace.
Angela, if you allow, I'd like to follow up on that. So when you have done in lots of different positions, you have dealt with peace, and I could imagine that perhaps at times peace meant different things to different actors involved. And feel free to elaborate on a case if you want to.
Okay, thank you. I think, first of all, peace is very abstract in a way, because as Michael and as Jalka said, it's what does it mean to people really to be in peace? And there are various dimensions of it. And when I was in the UN and I worked a lot in political affairs, it was basically, how do you get it? How do you actually achieve peace? What is needed in order to make peace between people? And there were always two visions of that. And one vision is you have to wait until a conflict is ripe. And no one really knows what it means when a conflict is ripe. How do you actually assess that? It's a very subjective assessment. And others felt you need to push that. And we were always at odds as to where it goes. But sometimes in the world, things sort themselves out. And I remember that in the early 90s, and that was after the fall of the Iron Wall, there was this huge optimism in the world. It's all going to get better. We're all going to be living in peace. We're going to be all friends together. And we're going to be a global community. And I remember what that meant for me in particular. There was a negotiation that was going on in El Salvador. And that came to fruition in early 1992. And I was hired just about 15, 16 months before then. And what brought about a conflict of long-standing, it was 12 years that the guerrillas, the FMLN, was fighting against the government. And then you had a president who was elected, and he decided that it was enough. He had the private sector behind him, and he wanted to have a negotiation. And so it is not only the people who desire the peace, but you also have to have the leaders who actually say, yes, we want to make that happen, and how can we make it happen? And so they asked the UN to come in, and I was working with Alvaro de Soto, who was the negotiator for, at that time, Pérez de Cuellar. And it was an absolutely fascinating experience, because they were groups of people, the very privileged class and the very militarized society, and then you had a group of guerrillas that had been fighting the government, and how do you actually make peace between those two groups? And that is something I can go into more detail, but I don't want to hog the whole evening. But on the other hand, it is very much, to negotiate means you have to make concessions in many ways. You have to actually sort of say, what is it that we want to achieve? The government has to give something, the guerrillas has to give something, but you also have to try to heal a society that is hopelessly broken, that is totally between two different versions of what is life like, a very privileged version and then an oppressed version of people who are basically at starvation. And I will never forget the first time I came to El Salvador, we were in the car driving on the highway into town, and there was a dead person lying on the street. I had never seen that before, and I don't know how many of you have seen that before, but certainly it was a shock. And so I said, we must stop. There's a dead body there. And they said, no, we don't stop, because this is a decoy, and something could happen, and you could actually be killed when you get out of the car. And that level of violence is something that, when you have a vision of peace, that is something that you want to not have. That is something that you want to have a peaceful life. You want to have it better for your children, and you want to have a life that actually brings you certain fulfillment and moments of harmony.
One follow-up question, because I'm interested in that. Was there, during the negotiations in El Salvador, was there a breakthrough moment here where you say this was a game changer? So now suddenly parties talked with one another in a different manner, and if that was the case, what brought it about?
Let me first of all set the scene. First of all, the negotiation was not conducted in El Salvador itself. De Soto, who was the main negotiator, spent 80% of his time in Mexico. And so there it was the Mexican government was supporting it, and they were conducting it. The breakthrough was really that when I came, and my responsibility was to develop one chapter, to write one chapter of the Peace Accord, which was how to create a national civil police. They had 4 branches of the for the police at the time, all of which were military, and they were interchangeable. It was a very militaristic, very violent society, and we already talked about the violence. And the military did not want us to meet with the guerrillas, and I felt I couldn't have a negotiation unless you got the view of the guerrillas, of what did they want in a national police, in a civilian national police. And the government and the military tried very hard to prevent us, and we had a team to prevent us going to meet with the military. The Catholic Church actually was very active, and they made it possible. We had 3 different forays to try to meet the guerrillas, which were all in hiding, obviously. And I remember we had 3 different forays to meet them, and when we finally did meet them, that was the breakthrough, because we finally had the vision. What did they want? You know, they had been fighting for 12 years. What did they want as a society? What did they want in the peace negotiation, and what did they want of the national police? And it was very interesting, because first of all they said they cannot be military. They cannot be military police. They have to be civilians, and right now there are no women in the police. And also, they also felt, because there was a lot of the people who were fighting against the government, they had not had a lot of schooling. So they wanted to have a vision for themselves of where could they go, could they have a job, you know, could they be employed, would they be accepted by the government? And the police was actually somewhere where we thought we could place these people. And that's exactly what happened. And that was very much a breakthrough.
Walter, there are oftentimes in the literature, if one reads about peace, peaceful change, and everything is about dispute settlement mechanisms. And in the OSCE, there are quite a few of those. Do they work? What are their successes? What are their failures? And if there are failures, and there probably are some, how could one go beyond that?
If I could just pick up on the point about conflict and how conflict itself is not a bad thing, I think that's interesting, because most people think that you should have cooperation. Certainly that's the idea in the OSCE. But I take the point that there's a difference between conflict and violent conflict. And that's what we're trying to address, is how can you have interaction between people, that they can express their differences, that they can come to some sort of solution. And I think for that you need dialogue, you need empathy, and you need the prospect that you're going to meet again, so that you can't have just a one-off transaction where you're going to try and get the best possible deal for yourself. If you're dealing with a neighboring country, you can't choose your neighbors. You're going to have to find a way to get along, and that will be over a long period of time. Now, on your specific question, the OSCE does have negotiating frameworks for the so-called protracted conflicts. Some people say they're protracted settlement processes. Certainly in the case of Moldova, that's been the case for 25 years. Also in Nagorno-Karabakh, Georgia. But I have to say, the case of Moldova recently shows that even after 23 years where nothing much happened, there can be a breakthrough where the parties realize the self-interest that they should work together, and that's happened 2 years ago. We're not there in Ukraine. There you have the Normandy format. You also have a contact group which is headed by the OSCE. But I think you need these places where you talk. It's not enough to say that you don't want to talk to the other side. You don't need to talk to your friends. You need to talk to your enemies. And I think that's why somewhere like the OSCE is useful.
Thank you. Lukas, there is the last 2 answers. There was always something about the relationship between strategy, having a plan to do something, and peace. What's the relationship between those two? Because traditionally one sometimes thinks the two are diametrically opposed to one another. Strategy is something about being selfish, pushing something through, and peace is something to be altruistic.
So first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I think
all too kind.
No, we're like you said, we're a young format, and we have been we're very engaged in a lot of topics: security policy, development policy, foreign policy, and we're just very hungry to get our ideas out there and to engage in exactly those kind of formats that you have so kindly provided us tonight. So thank you very much. Coming back to your question and probably touching upon a few things indirectly that have already been said. I think if one wants to look at the strategic, look at peace and strategy, or look at the strategic dimension of peace, either way, one really has to walk through a very foggy web of what is out there when it comes to what one would perceive as strategic planning and strategic thinking, and which is usually occupied by a lot of armed forces and security talk and military thinking. So I think in the end one really has to look at the role of strategy or decipher the role of strategy in military thinking on the one hand, and it also has to look at the role or look at the dimension of strategy in perpetuity of conflict itself, because I think in the end, I mean, peace, a long-term strategy is actually about long-term thinking. It's about getting prepared for something that is not there yet and achieving goals that are very distant in the future, or achieving a vision in a way. So if the vision would be peace, and if the vision would be, I mean, I'm being very generic here, but if the vision would be peace, and if you were set all your goals, all your policy instruments, all your tools as a state and instruments towards peace, you would actually achieve peace as well. And I think that is the only reason why that is not happening is because policy itself, and this goes along for every actor we look at. You don't even have to look across the Atlantic. You can look inside Europe, or you can look into Africa, or anywhere else really, is because strategy is being compromised, or that the peace that is potentially in strategic thinking as well, or could be achieved by it, is compromised by quick wins. So situations are very complex, and political actors like to achieve a lot of quick wins out of a given situation. So in order to achieve long-term thinking, which is actually the core of strategy itself, I think one really has it needs really a sober and critical reckoning with what is strategic thinking. And I think it also needs, in order not to fall short of this philosophic, peaceful element within strategy that is so often reduced to applicable military guidelines, basically, and that is compromising peace in itself in a way.
Markus, can I just give you one quote
Absolutely.
that I looked up? Somebody once said, "A vision without a strategy remains an illusion."
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's not the opposite between a vision and a strategy. You need a strategy to work towards your vision.
Definitely, no, that's a very good one. Going back to something that you said beforehand and asking Jalka, so Walter basically spoke about transforming conflicts from violent to non-violent, and then used two terms, was empathy and dialogue. How important are empathy and dialogue for this kind of conflict transformation?
Of course, they're very important. I want, before I answer this question, I would like to say that it seems to me that we are, the five of us here in answering your questions, we always look at a special perspective towards peace, and there are many pieces, yeah? There is not the peace. There is the peace that is done after the war, after the violence. There's a peace that is, as you mentioned, the human rights, food for everybody, all these basic rules that we have to achieve to build the base for people to learn how to transform conflict. Yeah? And I think that in the education of everybody in the world, but like nowadays, the number of people who learn to read and write and use the basic cultural techniques is rising, is getting quite up to a good standard. But we don't learn social competences. And each culture has a huge tradition of social competences which are necessary to be included in the education process. So transforming the energy of conflicts in something that is better understanding, of course needs empathy, but it needs also some basic communication rules, which methods, techniques that you can learn. It's somehow a different language and a different way of thinking. It has a lot to do, for instance, with being reliable for your inner monologue, listening to your own inner monologue and listen to what your thinking sometimes invites you to be violent, at least to think about violence or to imagine. There's so many possibilities to include this new approach towards differences into the general education system. And I have one certain saying that I always think shows best what I'm talking about, that if we consider how do humans or any possibility of development, how does anything develop? It always comes out of differences. It's necessary to look at the evolving process of everything, looking to find out what are the differences where it comes from, be it man and woman or be it whatever. It's always differences. Things don't come out of themselves. And if we consider differences to be the resource of all that is developing and growing, we have a different approach to it. It could be empathy, it could also be to really know my own needs, to being able to understand what is my position in this conflict and why do I need this and how can I express what I need. There's so little things, but so important.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, some measure of self-reflexivity, I think, yeah. There's another thing that you want to... Yes, Walter?
But if you have leaders who are narcissists, who don't reflect, how do you deal with that? Because these are not people who are doing the types of things you're saying are so important.
Yes, we have elections. And as long as people are not educated, they follow in the election process something that the media sells them, or the people, the narcissists sell them. Yeah? So it's of course a slow process, but I think the process is visible. We can see that 100 years ago, the population here in Europe had a completely different approach towards the idea of conflict. Yeah? So there is a kind of development, it's slow, but I'm hopeful.
There's probably an important debate there between the two, and probably it goes back a little bit to these different understandings of peace. Yeah? So it is true if one looks at Europe historically and over the last 100 years, then things have become more peaceful, at least in understanding this violent bit. Then obviously, but then someone working in an international organization trying to mediate, transform conflicts, resolve disputes, the time frame is a very different one. So there's definitely an important point there as well, which basically leads me to the next question. And Angela, I'd like to ask you that. If we look at the United Nations system, then there are actually lots of different conceptualizations of peace. There really are different pieces in a way. So there is, let's say in the Charter, there's obviously oftentimes this formula, international peace and security, which means more like a negative peace, something like that. And sometimes there's just peace, which is broader. And then there are all kinds of initiatives. Many of them started in the 1990s, UNESCO Culture of Peace, A Right to Peace, where there seems to be a multiplication of these concepts of peace. Does that help on the practical front?
No. Basically, I think we're talking about two different issues, not two different issues, but we're talking about two different levels. And one is the notion of peace or the concept of peace. And then the other part is how do you actually translate into action? And that's where, as far as I'm concerned, the rubber hits the road. And so when you talk about concepts of peace, and when you look at the United Nations or other international organizations like the OSCE, how do you actually achieve that? And you go over 75 years of existence, you go through various phases. You know, you had basically early mediation, which frankly, I mean, if you think the mess that we currently have in Libya, for example, was really caused by the UN, because the UN actually divided. There were certain commissions that basically split up some of the countries, just like, you know, some of the countries who had them as colonies split them up. So, you know, there are certain hereditary parts that we're now dealing with. But on the other hand, you had peacekeeping operations, which are not in the charter, which were basically to keep the peace very static. Then now you're moving to, or you're having peace operations. I think peacekeeping has run its gamut in many ways. And now you have a different approach, and that is a much more holistic approach to peace, meaning what does it mean for people to live in peace and in a good development with education, and you have sustainable development goals. You've got 17 goals that were adopted and that were elaborated with all of the member states, and we have until basically 2030 to achieve them. And it's not in good shape, and it's not in good shape because I think the whole motivation of achieving the development goals was really a strong support of multilateralism. We want to have a world which is a better place to live for everyone. And that is something that we are not getting towards, but we're actually getting away from at this point. And that is because certain leaders have a very unilateral vision of what they want to achieve. And unfortunately, that vision has become stronger in the last couple of years than it has become more diluted, shall I say. And that is something that I find very much of concern. But that does not mean that in individual cases where you can have a conflict settlement, or you can have a conflict negotiation, that you shouldn't try your utmost to actually achieve that. That, to my mind, is really something where the UN is strongest. But on the other hand, there are partial victories, if you so want. I mean, you can maybe look at, and I'm citing again El Salvador, what happened was that it was expected by the guerrillas that their vision would be vision of peace and life in El Salvador would be translated at the ballot box into actual political gains. That did not happen at first. It happened much later. And basically what happened right away is that every one of those people who were disappointed with that turned to gang warfare, which we still have. So you have to look at a longer-term vision. And I very much agree with Michael, who said that you need to know the history of it all. And I think that that is part of the problem, that sometimes, you know, we quote international mediators, and I say that with all humility, sometimes have this view is, well, we know it, you know, we've done this, we've been there, and we can actually solve this. And we have to have a lot more humility to sort of say we don't know everything. We also have to listen to exactly what is the vision that those people on the ground really want to achieve.
Can I add something to this?
Yes, absolutely.
Just very short, because you mentioned Libya and you mentioned history and contextual conditions. I think Libya is really the worst example when it comes to all of this. I'm glad you mentioned it, but I want to highlight also in the UN context that there are, like you said, a lot of cases where this has perfectly worked and where the UN played a crucial role in conflict transformation or resolution. I just, if I think about a few of them, one could probably say Nepal, for example, where the UN peace operation navigated or facilitated the dialogue between the Maoist rebels, if I remember right, and the government for a long time. So this was one, or Bolivia in another way, where the UN actually navigated a peace process between violent crisis and political conflict for a couple of years successfully, or just more recently in the Gambia, where a UN negotiating team basically, with the backup of a military force in the backyard, negotiated a transition from power from one leader to the other. So I think there are, and I think if you look at all of those cases, I think you can identify a lot of things that they have in common, and I would say it's about focusing on small wins, maybe, then that's something that you said as well. You cannot build it on build peace or on thin air. So you need the political will for it, at least in some parts. And something you also mentioned, you need to look at the contextual conditions of what is at stake, like socioeconomics, history. More and more, it's climate-related issues as well. So I think those three things: small wins, focusing on small wins, political will, and contextual conditions are really the key dimensions of what you should look at to make it successful and not to have the Libya case reproduced. Yeah.
And also we have, if we look at history, we can say there were the Hague peace conferences. There was the Kellogg-Briand Verband. There were the Völkerbund. 75 years ago, the United Nations was started. So, of course, it's a very slow process, but there is something going on. There is a development. And if we think how long it took mankind to develop any kind of law that was binding, of course, we are far away from real binding international law, but we are on the way. We are working on it. And I think, of course, the United Nations is not really giving what we expect. I'm a Quaker, and I'm the delegate of the European Quakers to the UN in New York. And of course, sometimes I think, oh, all these people, and what are they doing? And why doesn't it go faster? But then I think, yeah, mankind is slow. And if it's possible that thinking changes, I always consider thinking is the source where we have to approach. And when we look back in mankind, thinking has developed. And I hope it will still develop further on.
But can I say it's a little bit scary that the last few times there have been a vision of peace, it's only been after a war.
Yeah.
So 1815, 1919, 1945. Do we really need another war to have another new vision of peace?
That's actually something very scary. I mean, so because I looked into that in quite some depth, and that's really the case. It seems to be, literature refers to that as a cognitive punch. Something really horrible seems to, I mean, if that happens, then people are more likely to come to their senses and actually come up with these visions of peace. And maybe on an anecdotal note, so when people ask me about my current research and I say then something about peaceful change, then they oftentimes smile or laugh. I mean, I don't mean it in a bad way, but basically that the concept of peace has oftentimes a certain connotation that people don't necessarily take it seriously anymore. And that obviously is very, very different if one thinks about times when the UN Charter was drafted, or Euratom, or anything like that. But I'm going to hand over to Michael because he wanted to say.
Yeah, thank you very much. And it's very interesting that Professor Kemp mentioned, after the war, because I think if you're looking at visions of international peace, you should try to contextualize it. And by this I mean, post-Second World War, there was this notion, and we're referring to the history, there was this notion of the long peace in Europe, So whose peace are we talking about here? Because at that time, at that period, so, majority of African countries were being colonized, so it's very, very, dicey sort of to put this notion on international peace, on the other side of the globe, the countries being colonized, and on the other side, Europe was enjoying this long vision of, sort of peace, and it's been perpetuated in all history, this notion of, long peace vis-a-vis, what happens in other parts of, of the world. So I think it's very, very interesting to also take into consideration the historical perspective of international peace.
Yes.
I just wanted to add something because I think we have not talked about it, and that is that what is needed also is tremendous follow-up. And I think, for example, going back to the El Salvador case, basically we thought, okay, peace is there, they signed the peace accords, they're going to have to implement it now, and we walked away from it. There was another mission later on that was about discovering the truth. There was a truth commission, etc. But how important that is, it has now been realized because there have been studies made that show that if you really walk away after a peace accord, after settling a conflict, true, within 5 years, there's a very high likelihood this will happen again. And Lukas mentioned the case of Nepal, and I actually worked very closely with Nepal. I was in charge of it at the UN. And the difficulty with Nepal was, yes, it was a conflict between the Maoists and the government, and they came to an agreement, and the Maoists were basically in cantonments, they were in camps. Their arms were locked away, and they had to basically, the UN was accompanying this, and the UN had to open these little locked cabinets, and then they would take out the weapons, they would clean them, and then they would put them back. But the difficulty is that the government refused to absorb any of these Maoist fighters into their forces or into their police or whatever. And I tried very hard to negotiate with them, and I said, look, you have a lot of Nepalese peacekeepers. They would be invaluable because they have actual fighting experience. So actually they would be very good on the ground. Send them. The military totally refused, the government refused, and you still don't have a totally peaceful society in Nepal as a reason, because that lingers, because the government, the leaders have to be enlightened enough, if I can call it that, to sort of say, it's not enough that the conflict is now put aside, it's not solved. But on the other hand, you need to go the extra mile in order to actually knit together a society that is very divided.
Mm-hmm. In Boutros Ghali's Agenda for Peace, there appeared this concept of peace building. And that in a way tried to capture this thing, sustainable peace, or as it's sometimes referred to, as a concept that actually comes from Johan Galtung, from a peace researcher. But has that actually made a positive impact? So is there more of a sustainable approach now when it comes to peace missions, or less so? I mean, in the UN context, in the OSCE context?
Well, now there's this mainstream idea of sustaining peace, so that you don't just walk away after you've made the peace. But I think it's interesting, the words that we use, it's as if peace is an object, that you can make peace, that you build peace, you can keep it. We seldom say that you lose it, but you have to sustain it. And I think if you take that a little bit further, can you somehow see peace as a commodity? Can you incentivize making peace? That we use these expressions that you have to get buy-in, or you're trying to sell an agreement. If everything now is transactional, what incentives can you create to make people realize that the benefits are much greater than the costs? Because there are plenty of people who profit from instability, but can you also show that you can make peace and make money? I think that's a big challenge.
I have a question for all of you. It's a broad one, and then I'm gonna let you ask questions as well. If one looks at, say, the post-Second World War era, then and it came up a couple of times, then if we look at interstate conflicts, actually, for the most part, the international community has been very successful in preventing, in settling disputes between states, if one compares that to previous eras. If one looks at the record of intra-state wars, then it's quite a different matter. And we've mentioned a couple of cases already, perhaps in recent times, most shocking is probably the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So that probably is one element that seems to run against basically any understanding of peace. There are all kinds of other shocking statistics, say global health, for instance. So every 30 seconds, a child, because of malaria or something like that, dies, yeah? For things that would be actually quite easily preventable. If we look into the future, now really thinking about these visions of peace, what could we actually accomplish? And to some extent now, we're pretending a little bit like, say, after the Second World War, that these visionaries, they basically really focused on doing something about interstate conflicts. That was the main thrust of it. If one would draw up a new sheet of paper and think, we want to really reach progress and we want to make this more peaceful, how would that look like? What would we aim for? And how would we get there? A very, very broad question, and I think I'm going to just go one round.
Thank you for mentioning it. I mean, this is such a broad question, and I hope you stick with me for the next 3 hours, because I'm going to try to comprehensively answer everything. No, I'm just joking. I'm just remembering a couple of statistics that I read recently, and it touches upon your question. One is by UN OCHA, so the Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs from the United Nations, and it said that in 2006, if I remember correctly, the number of violent conflict and wars in the world, I know there are many different institutes that look into these numbers, but it said that there are 278 violent conflicts and wars in 2006. So, and what do you think? Like, did it increase from 2006, or did it decrease? It's like, hands up for decrease. So not very optimistic. So the rest, the rest who didn't put the hands up is right. It increased between 2006 and 2016 to 402. And according to the Center of Humanitarian Dialogue, the number of, it's a Swiss-based mediation center, I think the biggest one there is. There are 2 to 3 new wars and violent conflicts starting each year. And I've just recently looked in a paper that was produced on the margins of the World Economic Forum as well. There are the number of violent political strife within countries grew by 30% between 2018 and 2019. 30%. And this, I mean, you look at Lebanon just recently, you look at Hong Kong, you look at Chile, look at all these cases. It's very relevant if you look in what is happening around the world. And I then looked, and I'm going to stop right there, but I'm just going to make this point, and I think I have to read it because it's I didn't remember all of the reasons. I looked into reasons where this comes from. It was also I went through a couple of reports that touched on trends that produce violent strife and that focus on the inequalities. Or focus on reasons that produce inequalities that produce violent strife. And I'm not gonna read them all, but I'm just gonna point out the most important ones. And this is gonna touch directly on what you said. So the world in the next few years has to deal with economic recessions and bigger levels of debt that you have ever seen. Just look at China. Just look at Europe, where more states are indebted to a degree that has never been seen before. So all eyes on Portugal, Italy, Greece, Spain, and so on and so forth, and a reduction of economic power by Germany that basically was the safety net for the last decades. So there are more domestic and international tensions. There are increasing population dynamics. So what that means is people are growing older, and there are also a lot more young people on the market. So we have accompanying that, we have a rapid and increasing urbanization. We have climate change, resource scarcity. We have a revolutionary technological agenda that is basically will change everything we know about the way we live, the way we trade, the way we make politics, the way we live our lives, basically. Another trend is the future of work. This touches upon AI and versus what artificial intelligence would basically do to our work. We have growing opportunity and growing inequality. We have a more multipolar and more complex world. But at the same time, a very weak global governance. And at the same time, we have a health revolution. That's what you mentioned as well. With increasing health by a segment of the population and increasing sickness of a segment of the population, very different reasons. So if you put all of those things together, those are things that are very regional, very local. What is happening in cities, the role of mega cities. There are so many cities out there that have more than 10 million people that you've never ever heard the name of. So I think those dimensions of inequality and those trends that drive inequality will be a major source of conflict in the future. And I think any conflict prevention and any agenda for peace and any peace policy will really have to do its homework and look into this as well. It's not only about UN envoys going into Syria anymore. It's very real, and it in a lot of different contexts as well. For example, if you look at the most vulnerable populations will not be the working poor who didn't profit from capitalism and the way our global economy works in the past, but it will also be the middle classes who want to increase their levels of consumption and will drive resource conflict. But not to end on this very negative note on a Friday evening, I just wanted to say that a part of the solution will lie in the way we address policy, and not only foreign policy but also domestic policies. And this will have a lot to do with policy coherence. That takes into account a lot of different policy dimensions, and that are up till now are really reduced to pillars, policy pillars like trade policy, foreign policy, resource policy. Those will have to be integrated and looked into in a coherent manner. And I think that will do a lot to the shift of how we perceive peace and how we can live with peace and produce peace, or not let potential peace go down into conflict in the future as well. Sorry to be so long, but...
Well, I look at the development of the idea of peace as far as we can look back in history and in maybe books and dramas that play with the ideas. And I can see that throughout the centuries there is a development. And of course in all the times peace was always just the opposite of war. It was when there was no war. We have, for instance, in German the word Zwischenkriegszeit. When I was a child in Vienna, there was always the Rede von Zwischenkriegszeit. And it took me some time to understand what that means, that a whole generation time is named after the two wars where it was located between. So the thinking of mankind was very much that wars always happen. It's like coming from somewhere and it has to happen. And when it's over, then we have peace again. And in the beginning of the 20th century, there was a real strong leap of development in something like that psychoanalytic thinking, psychoanalytic science was coming up and asked us to develop another thinking. Quantum physics came up, asked us to have a different thinking, very difficult to try to think in these standards. And peace science developed. All these three sciences happened in the beginning of the 20th century. And I think this is not randomly. This means there is something coming in this world, something new, and we should look at it and carry it on and develop it.
Thank you. You mentioned the agenda for peace. I haven't heard that mentioned for a long time. And actually, I thought it was a pretty visionary document. It was kind of the charter written by a Secretary General. And it was written, I think it was published in early '93, so it's a long time ago. And it was rather attacked at the beginning. Everyone thought, oh, this is very good. But also, member states thought it was too far-reaching by the Secretary General. I mean, it was really overreaching on his part. And then they said, well, it's not only peace, it's also development. And they forced him to issue an agenda for development, which fell rather flat because it just wasn't such a good document as the first one was. I think that there are various ways to achieve peace, or rather to have conflict. And I find it interesting that we talk more and more about conflict rather than war, because there hasn't been another declaration of war since the Second World War, which I think people forget about, and you hear a lot about conflicts. And that's, of course, what is the definition of a conflict? I mean, whether it's 278 or 406, but what is a conflict? How do you define it? I think that's really where it comes down to. But you can fight for ways that are either for political power, And political power is important because it gives you access to wealth. It gives you access to possible corruption. It gives you all kinds of bad things in addition to the good things if you're a good leader. But it also, you can fight, like you mentioned Hong Kong, political freedom, very important. You can fight for human rights, you can fight for equality, you can fight for water, and you can fight for natural resources. And that, to my mind, is one of the really difficult aspects coming up. Natural resources, water, how do you actually govern the resources of this world? And if you look at certain parts of the world, look at the Antarctic, for example, it's a huge resource, but it belongs to 5 countries. And they have no intention to let anyone else muscle in on that. So there are conflicts that are already brewing, and how do you actually settle them? And that's why I think that it's easier these days to have conflicts in a way, because when you have a war, you used to have armies fighting on the ground. That does not happen very often anymore. And there used to be an expression that was coined, boots on the ground. You very often don't have boots on the ground. You kill people with drones or armed attacks or missiles or something like that. So we're really needing to rethink this whole aspect. But we also need to rethink about how do we approach it. And you mentioned intrastate conflict, and that's clearly one of the most difficult ones to solve. First of all, because very rarely is it the case that there is a, quote, mediator, international or otherwise, who's being asked to do the job of mediating between them. And very often the objectives of the irregular groups, if I can call it that, I mean, just think of Boko Haram or something, is really quite incredibly not only violent, but also rather repulsive, if you so want, in terms of what they aim. So how do you make peace, or how do you actually negotiate with a group like that? And if you do negotiate, and that was also the case coming back to El Salvador, you negotiate with groups that have blood on their hands. And that's also the case in the Congo, for example, as in many other countries.
So my 3 steps to world peace. Number 1, implement the SDGs. Number 2, and here I would take issue with Lukas, many more people die as a result of violent crime than from violent conflict. So my second priority would be to deal with organized crime. And number 3, build a greater sense of community, both at the local level, but also internationally, to try and deal with issues that people have in common, like climate change, pandemics, etc.
So, touching on the approaches to international peace, it appears that we are still on this sort of macro level. So I see it from the very micro level, which is the local level, the meso, which is sort of the regional groupings. For instance, if you're looking at regions like Africa, you've got the African Union, you've got the sub-regional groups, for instance, ECOWAS, which was very instrumental in resolving the political crisis in the Gambia. And then you've got this macro level, which is sort of the global systems. For instance, the UN is supposed to help us, ensure peace, and then you've got the peace architecture and all that. And it's at the macro level that we have the problem, because it appears we are still not listening to things that are coming from the micro level. For instance, I think, in my view, the global systems of maintaining peace is quite weak. For instance, you've got Kenneth Roth, who is the director of Human Rights Watch. He was supposed to launch the Human Rights Annual Report in Hong Kong, and he was denied entry, So it sort of falls back into the sort of international systems that are supposed to ensure that we have peace. On the other hand, where I come from Ghana, by the way. Ghana has relatively enjoyed sustained levels of peace, because when you're talking about peace, the ultimate goal is to have strong and effective governance, good governance, effective institutions. And what Ghana has been able to do is to strengthen its local institutions. For instance, there's the Chieftaincy Act, So it's strengthened the chieftaincy, the traditional, rulers and leaders, in a way that, when cases are decided in the chief palaces, in the traditional settings, they carry as much weight as cases being decided in the sort of judicial system. So in terms of our understanding of peace and trying to, project a vision for peace, when we have a blank slate, I think it's very important that she said we should listen, and it should come from the grassroots level up, not the other way. It shouldn't come from the top down. That has always been the problem, because you've got external people trying to come in and trying to tell you what to do. You know, it should be the other way around. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you also to you, because you were very patient and you've listened now to all of this for an hour. I think it's been very, very exciting. And I'm looking forward for the next 20, 25 minutes. And now you'll have the opportunity to ask questions. I anticipate quite a few questions and comments. I'm going to bundle always 5 of them. And so just raise your hand, and then one of our students in the back, they're going to come to you, give you the microphone, and perhaps quickly identify yourself. And then we know who you are. So the first, yeah, Roxana, first row, there seems to be a lot of, lots of questions.
Thank you very much. I'm a student here at the VA, and you touched a little bit upon it. The difference between tensions within a country, within a society, and tensions between countries. So I have 2 parts. The first part goes to Lukas, Wank. When you talked about modeling conflicts, are there differences in theoretical approaches when you model a conflict that is within society and between countries? And then from a practitioner's view, Kane, what is your are the different approaches for a mediator or for a UN mission when dealing with tensions and a conflict within a society or between countries? Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Olga. I'm a student at the Academy. And so you mentioned that there are different perceptions of peace and conflict for that matter. So you were talking about that there's differences on the European continent, and there's like Western perception of peace as well. And so I wondered, in the practitioners work actually on that issue, if these different concepts of peace and of conflict, if they interplay in, and how they interplay in the conflict management processes, so where you're involved. If you could elaborate on that.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm also a second-year MAIS student here. So if conflict is usually present if people lose a vision for the future, situation where they feel something's being taken away from them, that could be a change of the government, for example. How much is conflict then related to this inherent nature of people to have conflict, and how much is it to process out of their control? So what if peace is also imposed from the top? Is that real peace? So that would be my question. The other question I had would be, if an idea of conflict is to also bring about transformative change, what if that goes against what we consider peace? Is conflict sometimes necessary to bring about justice? And how much in the current world we have a hard time to analyze that? And I guess the third question I had was, how much of a factor does it play that people themselves assume sometimes that conflict is inevitable or that war will come? And I mention this because in the Balkans, there's this tendency or understanding that, well, we'll just have another war for sure, because every 50 years there's war in the Balkans. And there's even a famous song from a very famous musician from Zagreb who talks about the Balkans as an object and actually talks about a war being normal and being there every 50 years. So how much does that play a factor in basically war and peace?
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Allison. This is a question for Dr. Jalka. Going back to what you said about how important dialogue and empathy are in the peacemaking process, assuming that communication skills, dialogue methods are teachable, as a student here I can confirm that professors teach them and talk about them, and that these sort of dialogues can be facilitated by organizations such as the UN. I'm wondering, do you think that empathy is something that's teachable? And if it's not, can it be promoted by organizations like the UN?
Thank you. And then I have one more question left in the first batch. Yes.
Hi. Sorry, me? Okay.
Yes.
I'm Katrina, sorry. I'm also my student, my second year. I have a question for Kemp, actually.
Can you switch on the microphone? I think you may. Is it on? Or hold it close?
Pardon me, sorry. Good?
Yeah. Better?
Okay. Anyway, everyone can hear me. You mentioned that actually it's more people fall victim to organized crime than conflict. I was wondering what the most pressing issue is in that matter, like in terms of casualties, like where should we focus resources and time to? And then I also have a question for Ms. Kane. You said that moving kind of away from multilateralism to more unilateral approaches, and I was wondering if you think that this is a trend that will continue at the expense of, like the UN. Sorry, sorry, I'm doing something wrong.
Just hold it close.
Yeah. Okay, there we are. Okay, wow. Now my voice. If you think that moving away from multilateralism towards more unilateral approaches is a trend that you see continuing in the future at the expense of the UN's capacity. Sorry for my troubles with mic.
That's no problem at all. So, I just as a first batch, and then we're going to continue. I'm just going to give the questions quickly now to the podium, and really pick one where you think that, or several where you think that's really dear to your heart, Mike.
So I'll touch on Ogien's question in terms of sustainable peace and sort of transformative change. And my piece of advice will still boil down to the local level, because if you want to achieve sustainable peace, it is about empowering local people, because at the end of the day, they are at the bottom level. They have to deal with this sort of conflict, this sort of argument, having to face offenders, having to face perpetrators. For instance, the gachacha system that was introduced in the Rwanda case, it's a perfect example of empowering people at the local level to sort of bring local solutions to local problems. And this ties in beautifully to the AU's agenda of African solutions for African problems. So you've got to empower the local people, because at the end of the day, if all the experts comes from without, and then they solve the problem and they leave, the problem will still rear its head again. And that would also be in conjunction with follow-ups. You don't just solve a conflict and mediate a conflict and then leave and then assume that some magic one would happen and there will be sustainable peace. So it's about empowerment of local people. It's about inclusion. By inclusion, I mean gender balance. By inclusion, I mean hearing voices of women, victims' perspectives, And also, we should also take into consideration the post-conflict restructuring of such societies. And that ties in also beautifully with development. Peace without development is no peace at all. Thank you.
There were two, I thought, related to me. One, how do cultural perceptions affect the way that people approach peace? I think this gets back to the point of understanding the motivation of the people involved. So what is their history? What is their culture? What is their tolerance for the continuation of the status quo? What are their incentives to either continue or to stop? And again, as a mediator, you can't bring in your own perspective to this. You have to understand the conditions on the ground, because what you might think is something which has to stop, there may be a fair degree of tolerance for continuing it, because people would have their own reasons to. On the other hand, you have to understand the real feelings of the people on the ground who are affected, as opposed to the mandates of leaders. And in the OSCE, we have a mission in eastern Ukraine, and what we hear from people, common people on both sides of the line of contact, is that they want this to stop. But there are plenty of other people who don't. They want to turn it up and turn it down. How to stop organized crime. I teach an 8-week course here at the DA on that. Basically, you have to reduce demand for the goods and services that are there, and also to reduce the vulnerability of people who are the ones involved. But it's a huge issue.
Thank you for all these very good questions, actually. And one thing that kind of stuck in my mind is that one of you asked about how do you model an approach? And I think it's very dangerous to model an approach. I think there are people who are professional mediators, and it's obviously extremely valuable to be trained in certain techniques. But again, and this was reiterated, is listen, listen, listen. You cannot come with a preconceived notion of what you want to achieve other than that hostilities or conflict or war, whatever it is you're dealing with, has to be stopped. And it is not a confrontation, it's a negotiation. And you have to change your assumptions as you go along, because you really, when you listen and also study the history of it, I think I learned that very lesson when I dealt with the issue of Haiti, for example. I thought that I went in there with kind of thinking, you know it all and you can fix it all, and you can't, because you don't understand sometimes the complexities that are on the ground. And also understand that there are a lot of different actors. For example, Michael mentioned the ECOWAS in the case of Gambia. There are other actors. It's not only the UN. There are other groupings that are extremely effective, and that's very, very important. But what you have to try to do is to move from the rhetoric to actionable ideas. So how do you go from listening to the complaints to actually saying, and how do we actually solve that? How do you actually come up with suggestions between the two parties that you're trying to put together? And the other issue that you have to look at is you have to find supporters. And then, you know, we used to call them like groups of friends. When the El Salvador case, it was like the Contadora group. And that meant that there was a group of states, sometimes they were neighbors, sometimes they were in other continents, but they were very willing to kind of support the process and maybe also have some talks with either side or both sides in order to say to them, you need to give a little bit, you know, you need to move a little bit on this side. And then you also sometimes need financial support, because you don't always have the wherewithal to do certain things. So how do you actually get all of this done? You have to brief, you have to debrief, you have to communicate. And these days, particularly with regards to media, social media, what have you, it's very, very hard. Because one of the main issues is also you can never leak information. Whatever stays between the parties really has to remain. So otherwise you can lose your trust as an interlocutor, as a negotiator. And that's very important. And is conflict the only way to achieve change? I think one of you asked that. And I said, well, I think only as a way of last resort. If people don't see another way out, that's when they will resort to conflict. Because there is no other way that this, and sometimes it goes on for a long, long time until either both sides get tired, someone negotiates a mediation, whatever. But that is very often what happens.
Thank you for your question about empathy. I would like to start with a broader look at it, because if we consider how democracies work, we understand that we have to learn to think in different methods than of all the times of the past where in hierarchies people had a completely different, a much smaller, almost no possibility to live out their conflicts. In hierarchies, everything goes with punishment, and people know exactly what is their little slot of place. In democracies, suddenly we should all know how to participate, we should all know how to get along with each other, and we don't have these rules like they were. Even if you think of Austria, 75 years ago, the National Socialistic regime ended, but the thinking of all the people who were for this regime couldn't end, so stop. But now suddenly it was said, we are now a democracy. I always say, it was said, but who knew what is democracy? Almost nobody. So it takes a longer time. And yes, of course, I'm quite sure that you can learn empathy. and you can learn to deal with conflict. It's really a method, but it also needs to go inside yourself. If you want to be empathic, you have to first be empathic to yourself, to understand all the feelings, all the sensations that come up in your own personality and in your own body. And then you have the possibility to see and to recognize the same in others. So I teach this for many, many years now, and I can see that my students, they really gain life quality by dealing in a different way with these tensions, not being afraid of tensions.
Okay, and I'll also will touch upon your question. How do you approach intrastate? Do you approach intrastate conflicts differently? And I mean, Angela already touched on it. But just building on what she said, I would say yes, flexibility. What she mentioned is definitely it's going to stay the same between the two. But ultimately, you know, it doesn't even matter if you look at the difference between inter and intrastate conflicts. I think to establish peace somewhere, it's always you can only do so if you really take into account the local contexts. And this also touches upon what was already said as well. It's what you next also building on flexibility. You will what you want to add to your toolkit is basically the highest level of inclusion of local communities that you can possibly have. Because and this not only touches upon societies as a whole, but this also touches upon the integration of women, for example, in peace frameworks, and so on and so forth. And the more you fulfill, the more tick boxes you will fulfill in I mean, it's not a tick boxing exercise, but the more you take into account, the higher the chances are of achieving peace. And I don't think that's much difference between inter and intrastate wars. But I think what we really need to do in order to prevent this, I think to prevent risky and volatile situations, basically capsizing and turn into violent conflict and wars, is we need a very different understanding and evaluate the dimension of peace in policy making and in strategy even more from the very beginning. And I think and if we handle peace and if we de-utopize peace in a way, I mean, it's not a utopian concept. It's very much about bringing in people who know how to do security sector reform, demobilization, to establish transitional justice mechanisms, and to establish the rule of law in countries, for example, just to name a few. And I think if we think about peace in a different way, and if we integrate peace into our strategy making, into our policies in a very different way, this would take effect in whatever context there is, really, inter or intrastate. Yeah.
Let's do one quick last round of questions. Hands up, who still wants to ask question, comment? Okay, we have 1, 2, 3.
Good evening, my name is Marissa. I'm also a student here at the Diplomatic Academy. Thank you all for your contribution. It was very interesting. I have a question to all of you. It was mentioned during the discussion that dialogue and empathy are essential elements when it comes to dispute settlement mechanisms. And my question is, how does that work with two conflicted parties, which both have their own strong conflict narratives, linked, for instance, to historical events that they both perceive differently? I'm thinking in particular of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, for example. Do you think that dialogue and empathy are enough to make conflicted parties overcome their narratives? Or what do you think is the best way to for dispute settlement in such a complex situation?
Thank you. Susanne.
Susanne Kepler-Schlesinger, DA alumna, and now it's Deputy Director. Thank you very much for having organized this conference. I'm very grateful that Michael and Lukas both touched upon the gender question regarding peacemaking. And I would like to recall that almost 20 years ago, a very famous resolution was adopted by the United Nations Security Council, the resolution 1325 on women, peace and security. And here comes my question to both Ms. Jalka and Ms. Kane. Do you think that this resolution really has made an impact? Is it still relevant for peacemaking? Are women nowadays more considered as actors in peace and not only as victims of aggression? Thank you.
Thank you. And then there was one, yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Lynette Maestro. I was wondering if there are any examples of conflict or crisis that have been solved peacefully in Africa using the traditional setting. This is for Michael.
Good. So then I think then we're going to close the questions, and I'm going to hand over one more time to our panelists, and perhaps we're going to start again with Mike.
Thank you very much for the last set of questions. Regarding the Palestinian-Israeli issue, I'm not an expert on that. I'm not going to say anything. But what I would say is that Professor Kemp teaches a very interesting course here at the DA. It's called Cooperation and Trust. And I think it's very, very interesting if you want to, talk about that sort of conflict in terms of dispute resolution. You need these two ingredients, cooperation and trust. Touching on examples of conflicts that have been solved using the traditional methods in Africa, I can go back to my own country, Ghana, where we had the chieftaincy system being used in solving conflicts in the northern part that had raged on for years, There was no external mediation. Everything was done from the grassroots level. It was, with people, other factions who would say if they give in first, it's a sign of weakness, But if you use the sort of traditional mechanisms whereby people talk face to face to each other with, a traditional mediator, for instance, as happened in northern part of Ghana, I mean, it's a wonderful example that can be replicated. And I can still refer you back to sort of the Rwanda example, I cited early on, with the sort of gacaca courts rather than the Western notion of, the judicial system, sort of transitional justice, you punish perpetrators, and then, it brings sort of appeasement to victims, So that's what I would say on that.
Thank you.
3 short last points before I lose my voice. Number 1, on dialogue and empathy between two powers that have diametrically opposed views. When I was at the International Peace Institute in 2016, we organized a little meeting in Höfti House in Reykjavik, where Reagan met with Gorbachev, and we brought together the negotiators who were there at that time. And they said the difference between the tone in that meeting compared with the tone between leaders today is that after spending 2 days in this little house together, an effort was made to understand the position of the other, to put yourself in the other person's shoes. And you can't say that that meeting ended the Cold War, but it certainly brought them together and completely changed the position of the other and better understood each other as human beings. Finally, one expression we really didn't hear much of, except in the last intervention by Dr. Jalka, is the importance of rules. I think we need some kind of rules-based system if we're going to have a vision of a peaceful world. And if you think that's naive, look back to the UN Charter. That was an attempt to save future generations from the scourge of war. And it's worked in large part. So you need some kind of system that has a degree of predictability, fairness, sovereign inequality. And we don't necessarily need new rules, but we need to implement the ones that exist in the Helsinki Final Act, in the UN Charter, etc. And finally, I was inspired by what Dr. Jalka was saying about people needing to understand themselves better. I have a fridge ornament from the Nobel Peace Museum in Oslo, and I look at it every day. It says, "Bring peace to yourself before you bring peace to others." And I think there are many mediators who would do well to read that every day.
I did not answer the question that you had for the multilateralism, so let me just kind of add that quickly now. And you asked, what were the trends there? And I think the trends are really very noticeable. And unfortunately, we have seen that not only with the US president, who is totally transactional and certainly does not want to have anything to do with any other countries or alliances that have been made for many years and decades. But you also see that in other countries, and you see that even in Europe when you look at the European Union. And I think one of the crisis points was really with the big migration in 2017 that changed a lot of the parameters. And I think that's a very dangerous trend, and that still is percolating through the countries. So the trends, to my mind, are against multilateralism, or rather away from multilateralism. And it's interesting that, for example, Macron and Merkel had a proposal for an alliance for multilateralism. And they proposed that in September last year at the General Assembly, and that brought in a lot of other countries that basically also supported this. And again, it's an effort to basically put an impulse to make a push for multilateralism and to say by a number of member states, important member states, that this is really something that must be sustained, that must be supported. Very, very important. Let me also very quickly go about traditional justice in Africa. One of the examples that I found was really brilliant was in South Africa. In South Africa, again, there were a lot of atrocities committed on both sides from the two parties that were against each other. And many countries dealt with it in a way that they had truth commissions and that they did not give amnesty, but they actually prosecuted the people who had committed those atrocities if they were able to get hold of them. And South Africa dealt with it differently. They basically had hearings, and the hearings enabled the people to come forward and to tell their story. And I think that is really a very important lesson. People want to be heard. They suffered. They want others to know that they suffered, and they need to talk about it. But other than that, there was no judicial progress to basically prosecute these people. A very, very important example, which unfortunately has not been replicated in other places, but I think it's a very good example to look at that. And my last point is 1325. Thank you for mentioning that. This year is a very important year for the Year of the Women. It's Beijing 1995 plus 25, 1325. I was at the UN when 1325 was adopted in 2000, and it was Women in Peace and Security. And unfortunately, when you look at the history of how it developed, the initial years were all about women as victims. It was quite awful as far as I was concerned, and I was speaking out against it because it was really about women having a position at the table. And I was thinking about you and the history, about the history of peace. How many years have now women had the vote? It only came in like the early 20th century. And with Bertha von Suttner, remember, there's a long history, but I think that women having the vote has also made a great difference in terms of peace. Now, 1325 has come more to being an actor in terms of having women also at the peace table, but again, it wasn't due to the resolution. It wasn't due to the member states or the Security Council. It was basically because there's leadership in terms of appointing women to have seats at the table. And that was particularly made started with Kofi Annan, of course, and then was continued by Guterres in an even more heightened way. And empathy in the Israel-Palestine conflict, I think you said you can't choose your neighbors, and neither can Israel, and neither can the other countries choosing their neighbors, except that what has happened with Israel, that they're no longer part of the regional group in which they actually have their country, but they have made arrangements to join other groups, and that's the Western European and other groups, which is quite controversial, because you have to basically live for the countries that are around you.
I would like to answer your question about the 1325, and I think, of course, it has made an impact. It is just one stop, or one little activity in a long row. As you said, the fact that women were able to vote was already a big step. And I remember when I was young, I went to Germany, to Bonn, and wanted to study there, and I wanted to open a bank account. I was 19 years old, and I went to the bank and I said, I would like to open a bank account, and they said, but a woman cannot open a bank account. I said, huh, what? And it took until in the 70s, the late 70s, that women had the rights to sign a contract or to open a bank account. So it's not so long ago. And when I tell these the young students, they say, what, really? Is that possible? Are you so old? So, but it's really, it's a slow progress. But for instance, this wonderful project about the 1,000 peace noble women, yeah, it was possible to promote that and to do it because women were getting up and saying, okay, we are not just victims, we are really active people in this society, and we want to show what we can bring in.
Thank you.
Just a very short remark at the very end, also on 1325. I talked about inclusion, and I think when I touched upon these trends that are shaping our world that could potentially produce violence, strife, or conflicts in the future, a special focus, I think 1325 is very relevant because a special focus will need to be on those groups in society that are traditionally or that have been largely marginalized, and that goes for new urban centers, for example. That goes for that really goes for the resource scarcity that certain societal groups find themselves in a dilemma. That goes for a lot of things, and I think the spirit of 1325 will need to be brought back to the attention again. I think we will need to look at the role of women in a very different way again, and renew our approach on that as well. And I think this year of the 20th anniversary of this resolution is a good possibility to do so. We at Shabka will have a big project coming up on 1325 that will accompany it basically all year, starting in, I would say, end of February or March, where we will actually give voices to women in conflict and post-conflict areas on a couple of certain. So there's more coming up on that as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That means that's the end of our discussion. I hope you enjoyed it. I greatly did. I really learned a lot. Thank you very, very much to the panelists. I think it's time to...